Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are setting out on a seriously ambitious journey. We're going to take over 400 years of incredibly dense, complex history and distill it right down to its absolute core. We'll be looking at 5 transformative fires, the true crucibles, if you will, that actually forged the modern United States. Because really, if you want to understand how a vast, uncharted continent transformed into a massive global superpower, despite, nearly destroying itself several times along the way, you absolutely have to understand these defining eras. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be moving chronologically through 5 major acts: colonization and first contact, the fiery birth of revolution and independence, the relentless push of manifest destiny, the darkest hour of the Civil War and Reconstruction, and finally, the immense industrial explosion of the Gilded Age. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, colonization and first contact.
So, when European ships first appeared on the horizon, they were pulling up to shores that had already been governed by complex native societies for literally thousands of years. Now, looking at our timeline here, permanent English settlement, well, it actually took a while to take hold. By 1607, the London Company established Jamestown. Now, this was a purely profit-driven venture, and it was so brutal in those early years that settlers notoriously resorted to eating shoe leather just to survive. Yes, shoe leather. They were really only saved by John Smith's incredibly strict leadership. Contrast that with the Pilgrims who arrived at Plymouth in 1620. They weren't driven by profit at all, but rather by an intense, strict desire for religious freedom.
The dynamic of this first contact was just incredibly complex. Right off the bat, there was this pragmatic sharing of goods and survival tactics. Figures like Squanto were absolutely instrumental in helping those early pilgrims survive the harsh conditions. But that early cooperation, it was almost immediately shadowed by the devastating, unintentional spread of European diseases, like smallpox, which completely decimated native populations. Couple that with the relentless European focus on claiming land as their own, and you get this really complex collision of survival, cooperation, and tragedy. It essentially set the blueprint for centuries of policy to come.
Moving right along to Section 2, Revolution and Independence.
So, over the next century, the American colonies experienced a massive population boom. After the French and Indian War ended in 1763, Great Britain was left swimming in massive debt. Their solution? Heavily tax the colonies to help pay it off. Well, the rallying cry quickly became no taxation without representation. What started as just pushback against things like the Stamp Act and Sugar Act escalated super fast. Boycotts turned into the Boston Tea Party, which then led to the sudden, deadly violence of the Boston Massacre in 1770. The tension just kept building until it finally snapped in 1775 at Lexington and Concord, pushing the colonies into all-out war.
So the crucial point here is a profound shift in philosophy. When Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence in 1776, it completely transformed the conflict. This was no longer just a rebellion over taxes or trade duties, right? It became a full-blown revolution for unalienable human rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It finally gave the struggling Continental Army something incredibly profound to fight for.
But after winning their independence against all odds, these newly freed states faced an existential question. How on earth would they actually govern themselves? Well, their first attempt, the Articles of Confederation, was honestly a total disaster. It created a central government so weak that it couldn't even mediate trade or put down domestic uprisings like Shays' Rebellion. Basically, the nation was falling apart before it even truly got started.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how they solved that existential crisis. In 1787, they drafted a completely new constitution. They came up with this brilliant compromise, a system of checks and balances divided into 3 co-equal branches. You've got the legislative branch to make the laws, the executive branch to enforce them, and the judicial branch to interpret them. It was literally the first time a nation's government was explicitly built by the people, for the people.
All right, let's jump into Section 3, Manifest Destiny and Expansion.
With a stable government finally in place, the nation's eyes aggressively turned westward. Right at the heart of this era was the concept of manifest destiny. Now, this was the widely held, almost religious belief that the United States was unquestionably destined and entitled to expand its agrarian values and democratic institutions across the entire North American continent. I mean, just imagine packing your entire life into a wooden wagon. It was this exact ideology that motivated hundreds of thousands of pioneers to brave the brutal, often deadly conditions of the Oregon Trail.
And this expansion happened incredibly fast. The Louisiana Purchase literally doubled the nation's size in 1803, And the Mexican-American War brought in California and the Southwest by 1848. But we absolutely must look objectively at the human cost here. This exact same drive for land triggered the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and that led to the forced, tragic displacement of tens of thousands of Native Americans along the deadly Trail of Tears.
Then, the push west went into massive overdrive in 1848 when gold was discovered in California. To really understand the sheer scale of the gold rush, just look at this number. $550 million worth of gold was mined by the end of the 1850s. To put that into perspective, that is billions and billions in today's money. This massive influx of wealth and prospectors rapidly accelerated Western settlement and permanently cemented America's transcontinental footprint.
Which brings us to Section 4, Civil War and Reconstruction.
But as those borders expanded, a fatal flaw in the nation's foundation was exposed. Every single new territory added to the map ripped open an unresolvable, deeply polarizing tension over the institution of slavery. For decades, politicians tried desperately to maintain this fragile balance of power between free states and slave states through all these complex compromises. But ultimately, compromises failed. Events like the violent skirmishes of Bleeding Kansas and John Brown's radical raid polarized the nation just beyond repair. So when Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, Southern states began to secede. The Great Experiment was quite literally fractural.
The conflict officially erupted in April 1861 when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter. What followed was a horrific four-year bloodbath. The North leveraged its massive industrial might and railroad infrastructure, while the South relied heavily on highly effective battlefield tactics under generals like Robert E. Lee. By the time Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant in 1865, over 600,000 American lives had been lost.
And this brilliantly illustrates what came out of the ashes of that war, a profound constitutional shift. During the Reconstruction era, Congress passed three really pivotal amendments. The 13th abolished slavery, the 14th guaranteed citizenship and equal protection, and the 15th granted the right to vote. But while it was an era of incredible civil rights advancements initially, the eventual end of Reconstruction saw these promises largely abandoned in the South, and that led directly to the systemic oppression of the Jim Crow era.
Now, entering our final act, Section 5, the Gilded Age.
As the nation pushed past the Civil War, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 ushered in an era of unprecedented scaling. Fueling this massive industrial boom was a huge wave of human capital. Between 1877 and 1900, 7.3 million immigrants arrived in the United States. They took on the grueling industrial jobs that literally built modern cities. However, this rapid demographic shift also triggered severe social backlash. It led to exclusionary laws and anti-immigrant violence, as factions of the country reacted with real fear to the changing population.
Let's move to and see how this builds. This massive workforce fueled just absolutely staggering economic growth. Just look at these numbers. Between 1865 and 1898, wheat output jumped 256%, corn was up 222%, and coal output, it skyrocketed by an astonishing 800%. The nation's economy was shifting fast into a mechanized global powerhouse, deeply reliant on this massive, interconnected web of railway tracks, distributing goods at speeds the world had never seen before.
But here's the catch. That immense wealth was not shared equally. Not at all. As mechanization started replacing skilled labor, wages dropped and working conditions became increasingly dangerous. This sparked violent labor clashes all across the country. Major events like the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 and the Pullman Strike of 1894 saw hundreds of thousands of workers walking off the job. And tragically, these often resulted in deadly confrontations with federal troops and police.
You see, the Gilded Age was defined by this extreme contrast. On one hand, you had the so-called robber barons, the top 10% of the population who owned 3/4 the entire nation's wealth. They were throwing parties so lavish they famously handed out cigars wrapped in $100 bills, all while funding engineering marvels like the Brooklyn Bridge. But on the other hand, you had millions of wage workers living in abject poverty and dangerous slums. These brutal conditions were thankfully exposed to the public by a fearless new class of journalists known as muckrakers.
Which brings us to the ultimate question as we look back over this 400-year journey. From those complex first contacts, through the raging fires of revolution, the aggressive expansion across a continent, a horrific war that tore the country in half, and an industrial boom of incredible wealth and deep poverty, the United States has constantly been tested
It leaves us to ponder, as our world continues to change at a breakneck pace, will the nation continue to prove itself worthy of its founding ideals? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, keep questioning the history that shapes our world today.